Millennials probably gave Justin Trudeau his majority in 2015, and they probably re-elected him in the last two elections. And that is the group that has left him the most.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffat.
And today we've got Pollster David Coletto on, who runs Abacus Data, to talk about some really interesting polling he's done recently, looking into how financially stable Canadians feel and kind of the generational divides within that.
But before we chat to David, don't forget to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Welcome, David.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me both.
No, thanks for coming on.
So you've always focused on millennial voters, and in a recent post on your Substack, I noticed that it said that younger Canadians are less likely to call the environment and climate change a top priority compared to older Canadians. Is that new?
It is. It's new. It's I think there's always a misconception that younger Canadians care more about the environment or climate change than older Canadians. For a long time now, we haven't seen a big gap in that. And just to be clear, when we ask a question like, here are a list of possible things the country needs to focus on, what are the top three? You had consistently seen, older Canadians as likely as younger Canadians to do it. What I've noticed, though, more recently is when you are asking people to prioritize issues, younger Canadians now are less likely, as you said, to put climate change and the environment in that top three. And the gap between them and older Canadians is actually growing to the point where older Canadians, who I think we're going to talk about perhaps why, are more able and willing to say that should be the priority over other things than younger Canadians are.
When did that change?
I would say in the last year. I think what I've been seeing broadly in public opinion is a growing sense of scarcity. I think the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, for older Canadians, the healthcare crisis has focused the minds a little bit on a short-term focus. And for younger Canadians, I think if you're under 40, housing has become the overwhelming issue. And so when given a list of three things, you're often going to pick the things that are all related to housing. So we've seen a rise in concern about immigration. We've seen, the cost of living remain top of that list, and then housing become pretty close to a universally prioritized issue, but one in which young people in every part of the country now put close to the top of their list. And climate has just almost become a victim of it. Now, that's not to say that, again, when we ask people slightly different questions, do you think climate change is an emergency? Do you think it's important for us to deal with it? Large majorities of Canadians continue to say yes to those questions, including young Canadians. But when forced to choose and prioritize, right now, climate has fallen back on that list of issues.
That makes sense to me, because I think about how if someone's concerned about the environment, but they can't afford rent, like one of those issues is a much bigger issue in their life right now. Mike, were you surprised by anything that you saw recently in his data?
Well, I think it shows, the kind of changing issue set of millennials. I think it's, surprising to see, how quickly things changed last summer, where again you see that these affordability issues, which makes sense, that we've seen rents go up 10 to 15% in many markets for new leases. A lot of other things are up. So in this polling data, we've seen that change. But the interesting thing to me is, I can understand why millennials or other Canadians are upset with the federal government, and that affects their polling behavior. But, we're in a multi-party system. So why do you think it's the Poilievre and the Conservatives who have been really able to capture this in a way that the NDP or the Greens or in Quebec, the Bloc, haven't been able to tap into that disaffection?
Yeah, I think there's probably two or three explanations that combined to explain it. One is Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives have been probably the most consistent and relentless in talking about these issues, housing and affordability, and the broader, I think, malaise around the economic growth and trajectory of the country, and have done a better job than either of the last two Conservative leaders at litigating the state of the world and connecting it to decisions that the federal government has made, rightly or wrongly. I think that's been effective. Two is, I think we always sometimes forget, although I don't think it's the only reason, and people always say, oh, Bernie Sanders, but Mr. Poilievre is the youngest federal party leader right now. And so there is something about that I think matters. And then finally, although I don't think everybody understands the supply and confidence arrangement and the way that Ottawa always works and how the New Democrats are, from time to time helping the Liberals get by, but that matters. And it's hard to be the agent of change when, for many people who are unhappy with Justin Trudeau, you are the reason he gets to continue to be prime minister every day. And so you add all those together, and that makes the New Democrats, while more popular among young people than older people, the NDP still has an important base among younger Canadians, less so among millennials. I would say it's sort of Gen Z that right now are really attracted to the New Democrats, but they have not been able at all to build on Jack Layton's legacy, which was really, millennials when in the 2011 election, really not, they couldn't all vote yet, but they really embraced in large part the New Democrats. That's all disappeared.
They couldn't vote then, but now a lot of them are over 40 or in their 30s. Like we forget millennials are not like the kids anymore. I know as people age, like they tend to consider the Conservative Party they consider them more palatable. Is that something that is part of this, that they're just getting older and tend to vote more Conservative over the years?
I haven't seen evidence that confirms that. I'm going to call it a myth, right? That you, as you get older, you become more conservative, because I think I'm somebody as a political scientist who believes political parties change over time. They're not static either, and they react to the market that they're trying to serve. And so what I think's happened is a bunch of global events, context, and a government that's been in power almost 8 years that I think has left a lot of young people who overwhelmingly embrace this government. I argue in the piece I wrote, and you look at the data, that millennials probably gave Justin Trudeau his majority in 2015, and they probably reelected him in the last two elections. And that is the group that has left him the most. That's the most movement among any generation, among any demographic, has been among that cohort. And there has to be a reason why. And I think it's because of just how disappointed. I don't even think it's anger. I think it's disappointment that they feel towards how they perceive the government to have responded to the crises and the anxieties that they're feeling.
According to your data, millennials are kind of issue-based voters and not as like kind of tied to the political party system as some other generations have been. But I know that all the parties are probably trying to open their tents and welcome those millennials in. How should they be thinking about it if they want to attract millennial voters into their system?
Well, I think, I argued I wrote a book chapter after the 2021 election in an academic book that gets done after every year, after every election. And I made the argument in that one that the millennials became more issue-based in that election, not necessarily because and I don't think they're as partisan as previous generations. I think we're all becoming less overtly partisan. I think still we're tribal in some way. But the reason I said that I think the allure of Justin Trudeau in 2015 was what I think attracted young people into the political system. It engaged them. You saw turnout rise. I mean, it wasn't about any particular issue. It was about a theme. It was about change and hope and all those things that he represented so effectively, I think, at the time. But now where I think age and life stage matters is as you get older, you don't become more conservative. You just become more responsible. You have more responsibilities. And so if you want to buy a home or you want to start a family or you have a job and a career that you need to secure, those things become the primary, I think, preoccupation. And the result has been that they are like others. And I'm somebody who thinks that voting behavior is strongly correlated to a basic formula. I'm going to vote for the party that I think is best able to handle the issue I care most about. And to go back to what we said earlier, if the issue set right now for most people is cost of living, housing, healthcare, the top two, when you ask people who care about those issues, which party do you think is best able to handle it, including millennials, they say overwhelmingly the Conservatives will do the better job on that. And so that, I think, is what's happened is they have moved past the culture, the conversation. I mean, I think the Conservatives still have lots of liabilities with younger Canadians around climate, around equity issues. But right now, it is all about that scarcity that they're feeling. And so they kind of look past it and say, I'm just going to go to the option that I think right now is going to best help me on the issue I think I need the most help on.
So, I'm rapidly approaching 50. So I basically use the term millennials incorrectly to describe anyone who's significantly younger than me. So, I've seen in some of your recent polling reports that you've kind of aggregated it out and are able to, split things a little bit finer by age. Are we seeing substantial differences between millennials and Gen Z on these issues?
Surprisingly not. I mean, the youngest cohort, if you're, say, 18 to 20, there are slight differences on what's important, as you might expect. To somebody like me, I'm an old millennial. I'm 42, and that's just a life stage thing. I think there's a lot of similarities between younger generations on views around equity, on questions on equality issues, on climate in particular. I think the younger cohorts, while I said earlier they don't differ in their priority around climate, I think there's a deeper anxiety about it that's affecting their behaviors and the planning for life in a way that a 60-year-old doesn't need to, because they'll be gone before probably the worst of the consequences are felt. And so when you look at even those under 25, under 20, the Conservatives are still leading among that cohort, which to me is the biggest story of Canadian politics today. Because, Mike, if you had asked me a year ago, if I'd given you a data set that said the Liberal Party of Canada, Justin Trudeau, is more popular among Canadians over 60 than he is among Canadians under 30, you should have said to me, David, that data is bunk, send it back, redo your survey. But we have consistently seen that happen now. And so you have to ask the question, why? Are the public policy choices that the government are making having a disproportionate benefit to seniors than they are to young people? Well, I think I'm not the policy expert like you both, but I suspect the answer is probably yes. And Canadians are not dumb, and they recognize that. And I think you're seeing the political consequences of that play out every day right now.
I'm surprised there's not more goodwill to Trudeau for at least the childcare plan, because that's something that, like, I always say I would not be able to afford my home if I didn't have that childcare plan in place. And obviously I was lucky enough to find a spot. That's a big challenge, but you'd think there'd be at least some goodwill for that. Yeah,
I don't believe that voters thank politicians for the rest of their voting life for things that they've done in the past. It was an important policy change. It's going to have, if it stays in place, it's going to have big impacts on the labor market and make life more affordable for folks like you, Cara, my sister, others who have young kids. But people pivot pretty fast, to use that word, and say, okay, what's next? And I think right now, and if we talk politics and policy, most Canadians don't believe that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, if elected, would get rid of that program. So until that fear is created or is believed, you're not going to make that choice feeling that you're going to lose it. And I also think there's a lot of young parents who feel that the program wasn't well designed, they can't access it. You hear lots of stories about childcare centers not feeling that it runs. So there's mess on execution, which happens a lot. And I don't understand the obsession that politicians have of continually reminding people of what they've done and think that's sufficient for them to vote for them in the future. Voters are prospective thinking. They don't often, the only thing they think retrospectively about is if politicians cause them harm. Mm. They don't think retrospectively about good things politicians and governments do.
You had a poll recently that showed that more than 2/3 of people think the housing crisis will worsen this year, and even more think that it'll worsen for first-time homebuyers specifically. And you found that more than half of people who rent have given up any hope of ever owning a home. What message does that send to our politicians?
Well, it's a signal, again, these are perceptions. It's a signal of just how big a problem this is. Outside of the policy problem, the perceptual public opinion problem that has been created means that you can be, I think, and Mike and you can argue with me about what the federal government has done. I think they have been signaling an urgency in a way they haven't maybe in years, right? The last year, I would say there has been a sense of urgency as somebody who observes politics on the housing file, at least rhetorically, that has not yet comforted people to feel that it's going to get better, right? And we ask people to reflect just on the rest of this year. So it's a short time window and it's a big problem that's going to take years to solve. But I think it reflects how deep this concern is. The other thing that's important to note that we didn't really report in the data we released last week was that this fear about the crisis getting worse, about first-time homebuyers being unable to buy, about being able to pay rent, is universal. It is not just young people saying this. This is not just aspiring homeowners who are saying this. It is everybody. And that makes that perception so politically challenging and damaging for any incumbent government trying to grapple with it.
Yeah, Mike and I have talked about how there's a lot of things that the government's doing to affect the long term. And if anyone wants to hear or to read ideas of what Mike and I were suggesting that they could do in the short term, we did publish something on the Hub this week, and hopefully the government will read it and consider some of the ideas. Mike, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so we're certainly hoping that governments read these. So speaking of which, Trudeau got himself in a little bit of hot water in Hamilton, Ontario last summer when he said something that was technically correct, which academics love being technically correct, and the general public absolutely hates it, which is about the federal role in housing. Do we know from your polling data who voters blame for the crisis and who voters expect to fix the crisis? Is it the federal government? Is it split between all three levels?
So 3 data points from a survey we did last fall. We did a big national survey with the Canadian Real Estate Association exploring some of these questions. And the first data point is, when you ask people, are you satisfied with the federal government, your provincial government, and your municipalities' efforts to deal with housing affordability and accessibility? Universally, everybody says, I'm dissatisfied with all of them. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, when we distill that down and say, okay, but who do you blame the most? Who's most to blame for this? Municipalities get off scot-free, only like 12% or so say municipalities, and then the rest lean more federal. It's about half say federal, and then the rest fall about 40% say their provincial government.
That's really interesting because I know Poilievre has really tried to bring the narrative into it's the municipal gatekeepers that are stopping it. So that's not working.
It's not working yet, but I do think that is shifting. I think there's a growing recognition because the spotlight is turning on them and they are being asked, okay, the feds have this program, the provinces is trying to speed up approvals. Why isn't it happening? Is there something happening on the ground in municipalities? And then Mike, to your question on, okay, so who's responsible? Well, if you feel that the feds are to blame, then you are naturally inclined to think they have a role in solving it. And so, yeah, I think it was, while technically maybe correct, politically incorrect to say it's not our problem. It's like healthcare. If you're a federal politician, you say, look, it's not our problem. That is missing that is technically correct, but politically incorrect, I'll say, to use that kind of language. And so, yeah, there's no level of government is immune to this crisis. And although I think politically it's hurting the feds more than any of the others. Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, takes this issue as a priority. Do they think he's done enough or have produced results? No, but it's not hurting him as much, I think, as it is the federal Liberals.
I found it really strange the way you talked about in one of your pieces about how that financial insecurity is kind of across the board. And I think about how many people own houses, bought them probably a while ago, are sitting on assets worth $1 million, $2 million, especially if they're in Toronto or Vancouver. But there still seems to be that financial insecurity piece across the board. And I can't imagine having that much equity in my home and still feeling financially insecure, because I know that you have to live somewhere, but like, I always would think that, well, I could always sell it and rent, or there's a solution here where I could access that money. Why? Or I guess really the question is, what do you do when you're a politician, when people feel insecure, but they actually they do have a ton of wealth?
Yeah, I imagine that is, I think my parents are super privileged. I was privileged to be born to them. They have a nice large house in Richmond Hill, Ontario that they don't need, but are not moving out of it because they don't have a better place to go in their mind, and they shouldn't be financially insecure perceptually. But I think there is some, right? Because they don't know what the future holds, and they don't know how long they're going to live. And I think they actually are ill-informed about how well off they actually are. The Scotiabank keeps reminding us we're richer than we think. I should say that's true. I think people don't actually understand how rich they actually are in the case of their equity in their home. So if you're a politician trying to navigate that, you can't go out and tell people, hey folks,
you're richer than you think. You're
richer than you think. It's time for us to move past it. There's stages of this housing crisis's effect on public opinion. And I don't want to take too much time here, but 5 years ago, it was a highly isolated issue in which younger people and those living in Toronto and the lower mainland of Vancouver understood and reflected. But now I think we're now entered a phase where people are starting to understand the consequences of this. So we're understanding that Ontario is less competitive because our housing's so expensive. So people are leaving our biggest cities or leaving the province entirely, is an example. I think people are understanding that that homelessness is an issue they see every day that they didn't normally see as much. And so they're asking themselves why. And it's very much in their face. And then lastly, and this is the question I'm going to be trying to explore in the next few months, is it leading to a generation or two of people who fundamentally believe that the political and public institutions of the country are failed because they've created a situation in which they can't live the same kind of life that their parents' generation did? And what kind of political instability does that create?
I can't imagine how dangerous that is to a country when a huge group of people feel like the institutions have failed them. That must be something I don't even know how you start to come back from that. Any thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, I'm actually going to do something I never do on here, and that is I'm going to defend the boomers. Just wait for it a sec on this. That I think the millennials telling boomers just sell your homes and rent is the equivalent of boomers telling millennials just stop it with the avocado toast and going to buy coffee.
Except that one of those is real and one of those isn't. You can't stop eating avocado toast enough to save a down payment. You literally could sell your home and rent if you wanted to do that.
I actually disagree in a lot of markets that there is a real lack of seniors-friendly housing. And in particular, we forget about a little thing called transactions costs, right? That, let's say, I pick on my parents a lot, so I'm going to pick on David's folks a little bit, even though I've never met them, and I'm sure they're lovely people. So if David folks go and sell their home and try and downsize into something smaller, first of all, they're going to get hit with a huge land transfer tax, right? So, that you take a big percentage of the sale off of there. Then you get slapped with the realtor fees and everything like that. So you're losing 10% above the board. Then you're going to buy into either buy a place, so you're downsizing, and there's not a lot of seniors friendly places that have or close to amenities, near parks and that kind of thing. Or you rent and you go through all the fun that renters go through in this country, where they worry about rent evictions, they worry about their landlord playing stupid games and having their rents go up 15%. So I actually think and my point here is not to defend the boomers, because that's not what I do.
Do you think if they affected boomers, that would be resolved? Those rental issues, the government would take in more action if it was widely affecting boomers?
No, I disagree. And I actually think that this is where the federal government got it completely wrong. I believe they thought like you, and I believe they got them to where they are today. Had they understood that this issue is not as zero sum as it looks, and in fact, that had they done more to create more seniors friendly housing, had they been less concerned about tanking home prices, which was never really going to happen. So I think there is, I think what you're saying, Cara, is conventional wisdom. And I think that most people listening to this will agree with you and not agree with me. But I actually think conventional wisdom is wrong here. I think that there is the potential for win-win solutions. And that, telling boomers, hey, go sell your home and rent is not an option. And the fact that it's not really a realistic option for a lot of people actually creates policy space for politicians to get bold on housing. So, if I seem like I'm pushing a little bit, it's just because I'm frustrated because you made me defend boomers, which is
well, I'm not going to pile on though, because I actually think, one of the things that I get, the privileges of my job is I get to put myself in people's shoes all the time. And Mike, I don't think I actually agree with you, right? Like we were talking about financial insecurity. Why is it that, 42% of 60 plus year olds feel financially insecure? Well, if you own a home and you've paid it off, guess what? That is the most secure thing you have. That is the hope, and thing that keeps you feeling, at least I have this house. At least I have a place to live that I've lived in probably most of their lives, right? I think of my parents. And so to get them out of that home requires them to feel as secure or close to as secure in wherever they're going. So rental, Mike, great point about that. And the lack of, I can speak just only about my parents. If we're talking only about my parents, if there was a suitable bungalow available for them within a 15-minute drive of my sister and her kids, because they want to be close to their grandparents, they would be gone and selling that house in a moment. And there isn't. And so, Mike's the economist. Cara, I don't know if you're formerly an economist.
A journalist that's covered this a lot.
I think a lot of people are rational. There's irrational behavior, but there's also rational behavior. And that makes complete sense to me. I'll defend the boomers sometimes too.
No, there we go.
They need to stop telling us to just move then, because that is equally unrealistic. I must say that. You founded Abacus Data in 2010 after graduating from the University of Calgary with a PhD in political science. And so what made you go from studying political science to wanting to start a polling company? So I'm one of those, first of all, weird people who, for whatever reason, always wanted to be a pollster. I don't think there's a lot of kids who grow up and say, I want to be a pollster. That's amazing.
But I didn't know what I wanted to do or how I wanted to do it. So I think I took a 4-year kind of hiatus and went to grad school and did my PhD. But I was always interested in understanding why people think and do things politically that then created. So I did my PhD, but then this opportunity to start Abacus came along and I took it. It was the thing I always wanted to do. And I found my grad degree was a natural extension, and the next step would be to do it. So I am doing exactly what I hoped I would be doing 25 years ago when I, thought about where to go to post-secondary. And
where'd you think
cool.
of that?
I don't know what the moment was that said, I want to be a pollster, but I applied to Carleton University because it had this new public affairs program that had a strategic public opinion specialization. It was, something happened in high school that got me really interested in politics. I was always a numbers guy. I was the kid who would get the Toronto Star. I grew up in Toronto and would go to the sports page, right to the box scores for all the baseball stats. And I would just pour over those stats. So there's something there that I think meant, okay, well, if I got really obsessed with politics, then I would have to look at politics through a box score, and polling is probably the equivalent to that in politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. It's really helpful to have your insights. So we're grateful that you fulfilled your dream and were able to come and explain to us how this all works. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I love any discussion that ends in baseball box scores. You had me there.
It was fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for watching and listening. And thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any burning economic or housing questions, please feel free to reach out to us at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.